When we moved to Atlanta 47 years ago, we purchased the first home we had ever owned. And that meant we also purchased the first lawn we had ever owned. And I wanted it to be a nice lawn, a lush and green lawn, a perfect lawn. Because, well, I'd always liked lush and green lawns, perfect lawns. The builder, however, clearly did not share my passion for nice lawns, because what he called a nice lawn, I called a sorry excuse for a lawn. So I immediately set to work on the rock-infested, mangy-looking expanse that was our front yard. I raked it down, reseeded it, fertilized it, watered it, and then seeded it again. I was determined to have a nice, perfect lawn. Since it was fall, my efforts paid off handsomely. The cool October nights and warm days brought forth a wonderful lawn, green and thick and rich. And I couldn't wait for the following spring for my lawn to really take root and give me month after month of enjoying the fruits of my labors. And finally, spring sprung. But with the springing of spring, something else sprung. Weeds. Not just a weed here and there, but weeds everywhere. I had never seen so many weeds, and not just one kind of weed, but every kind of weed. And soon my perfect lawn was perfect no longer. Gradually, it dawned on me that growing a nice lawn in Georgia was to be engaged in a never-ending battle with weeds. But I felt up to the challenge, and I declared all-out war. I applied weed killer. I yanked up weeds, I dug out weeds, and applied more weed killer once again, all to no avail. It was as if there was a conspiracy among the weeds, a secret agreement, that if one weed was killed, a new weed would immediately volunteer to take its place. By the end of the typical July drought, my beautiful yard had turned ugly brown, except for the weeds. They were a healthy green. And in a weak moment, I almost decided just to let them take over. But I resisted. I decided to do battle even harder, and battle I did into the fall's reseeding. I reclaimed my lush green lawn and felt I was winning the war at last, and had the weeds in full retreat. But then spring sprung again, and with it came fresh troops of weeds, battle-hardened weeds, battalions of weeds, undaunted by any attack I could mount. But I wasn't about to surrender. I would not concede defeat. Instead, I called in the pros. Come on. I hired mercenaries to do battle for me. And the pros got them, defeated the weeds, brought them to their knees, leaving me to enjoy at last a lush, green, perfect lawn. And time to attend to other weeds, weeds in the flower beds. Now, I'd always liked nice, perfect flower beds, clean and well organized, with no weeds, and with flowers that looked like flowers. But the flower beds had always been the province of my wife, Kitty. However, with the war of the weeds won, I decided I should lend a hand with the flower beds. So one day, I cleaned up a bed that was becoming overgrown with very odd-looking weeds. When Kitty came home and looked out back, she said, "What happened to my flowers?" I said, "What flowers?" And she said, "The flowers in the back bed." I said, "There weren't any flowers, just weeds." She said, "Those weren't weeds, they were wildflowers." And I said, "Well, they look like weeds to me. Flowers should look like flowers." She said, "They did. They looked like wildflowers." And I said, "But they were ugly." And she said, Well, let's not go into cheese. Let's just say that I was banished to the pine beds, on which I did have permission to spray clearly identifiable weeds. But as far as other weeds and flowers went, I just finally decided the best policy was to trust the pros, leave it to those who knew what they were doing. So I cut the lawn, did the reseeding, watched kept on treating the weeds, and let the flowers grow. Even the ones that sure look like weeds to me. Now, what brought this to mind today, of course, is that parable we heard as our gospel reading. The parable of the wheat and the weeds. The story in which a farmer allows weeds sown in his field by an enemy to grow together until the wheat, until the harvest. And one thing jumps out at me whenever I hear that parable, and that is that Jesus certainly would have had a really lousy looking lawn. And he wouldn't have amounted to much as a farmer either. As any gardener or farmer knows, weeds choke out the good plants. And so you've got to pull them out. But not Jesus. He had the farmer in the story tell his workers who wanted to pull out the weeds to leave them until the harvest, when the reapers would do the sorting out. So why does Jesus let the wheat and the weeds be? Well, one reason is that the roots of the wheat and the roots of the weeds are all tangled together. So when you pull up the weeds, you might also pull up the wheat. Another reason has to do with my wife Kitty's flowers. Sometimes flowers look like weeds. Sometimes you can't tell the difference. So sometimes you pull up the wrong thing. So it's best to just let them grow together. Of course, Jesus was talking about the way it is with God in the kingdom of God, not lawns. He was talking about the way it is with God and people. And that suggests that God takes a very different approach, very different than many Christians do. Christians often go after the weeds, the people they see to be like weeds, and they want to pull them out. Never let them be. Christians seem to have this tendency to want the world, their churches, their own lives to be like perfect lawns, to be weed-free. And Christians today seem more determined than ever to have a weed-free world, to root up all those they consider to be sinners, pull up the ones they see as bad, weed out the evil influences. And Christians seem intent on having weed-free churches as well, to have only the right kind of people in them. People have the right kind of thoughts, have the right kind of beliefs, the right kind of behavior. And weed-free lives, too. No mixed motives, no jumbled desires or thoughts, no confusion within. And many Christians think that's pretty much their job, to identify the weeds and pull them out, so that the world and churches and our very lives are like perfect lawns. But what the parable suggests is that that's not the way it is, nor is it the way we can make it to be. Let's face it, good and bad are all tangled up in this world. The very things that can be used to give life can also be used to take life. The very things that can help can also hurt. And something or someone is always sowing trouble or chaos or evil in the midst of things. And all tangled together in people's lives as well are creative thoughts and destructive thoughts, love and hate, kindness and cruelty, acceptance and prejudice, generosity and greed, self-giving and self-centeredness, and always the mixed motives. It's there in Christians and churches too. All this tangledness. I remember years ago going to look for a new car. I made the mistake of telling the salesman that I was a pastor. His eyes lit up, and he immediately told me that he himself was a fine church-going Christian. And he would talk to his boss about getting a special deal for a man of the cloth. The deal he returned with, well, I figured, quickly calculated, that the deal he offered me, Christian to Christian, would cost me $2,000 to $3,000 more than if I'd been an atheist. Let's face it, some believers are the biggest crooks in the world, while some non-believers are as honest as the day is long. Some believers are so cruel it makes your blood run cold, while some non-believers are so kind you feel warm in their presence. This world, and all of us in it, are just this mixture of good and bad, all tangled together, as the parable suggests. And our job is not to try to sort out the weeds from the wheat based on what we consider to be weeds, or what we consider best for God's kingdom. Because chances are, we'll do more harm than good, hurt more than help. And the truth is that again and again, well-meaning religious people have inflicted pain and hurt on others as they sought to create that perfect lawn, the perfect community or church or world. Have you ever seen an English garden? You know anything about English gardens? Well, they always look like a mess to me. There are all kinds of flowers and plants stuffed together. And many of the flowers do look like weeds. And when I see one, my temptation is always want to organize it, clean it up, make it look the way I think it should. Of course, by the time I was done, I would have ruined it. We live in an English garden of a world. English garden churches and lives. There's so much that is beautiful, and yet so much that is ugly. And it's all tangled together, growing together. And the trick is to leave it to the pros who know what they're doing. Leave the sorting out, the weeding out, to God. But then, what's our job? Well, how about continuing to plant good seed? How about continuing to nourish within ourselves and others in this world a good crop and help it to grow as best we can, given the circumstances? I have a feeling most of us would have our hands full if we took seriously the work of planting and forgiving and healing and helping and encouraging and nourishing. That's our job. And we're to do it in spite of the tangledness within ourselves, in spite of the mixed motives and jumbled thoughts and desires. And we're to work hand in hand with those who are entangled themselves. God doesn't wait until our motives are pure and our beliefs are doctrinally correct to use us. Again and again in Scripture, God uses the most tangled people imaginable to work His purpose among His own tangled people in a tangled world. To put it another way, our job is not to weed the kingdom, but to be the kingdom. An author who was invited to speak at the anniversary of the founding of a church discovered that the founding pastor of the church was actually his wife's great-grandfather. So he decided to do some research about the gentleman. And what he came across was an incident that he says serves as something of a parable for all of us. He described what happened like this. In 1880, the young pastor was summoned once at midnight to the bedside of an old woman who lived by herself with not much in the way of either money or friends, and who was dying. She managed to convey that she wanted some other woman to come and stay with her for such time as she might have left. So the pastor and the old woman's doctor struck out in the darkness to dig out one for her. They knocked at doors and threw pebbles at second-story windows. One woman said she couldn't come because she had children. Another said she simply wouldn't know what to do, what to be in a crisis like that. Another was suspicious of two men prowling around at that hour of the night and wouldn't even talk to them. Finally, in the words of the memoir of the pastor, they rapped at the door of a humble Irish woman, the mother of a brood of children. She put her head out the window, said, "Who's there? And what can you be wanting at this time of night?" They tell her the situation, and her warm Irish heart cannot resist. "Will you come?" they asked. "Sure, and I'll come," she said, "and I'll do the best I can." And she did come. What she did was the best she could. And that is what God asks of us. Not that we be perfect or make this world perfect, but that we do the best we can to be his kingdom of love and hope, that we keep planting and nourishing grace and mercy and peace, and let God deal with the tangle within and the tangle without. Now, God's way is different, that's for sure, and thank God that it is, because if God ever weeded us like we want to weed others, we wouldn't stand a prayer. Not a prayer. But God doesn't. God knows us well, knows the crazy tangle we are, and knows too how often we get it wrong with others and about others. So God frees us from the need to be perfect, calls us to trust him, and leave the harvest to the pros. Trust that little by little, God will get it all sorted out, so that at last we in this world will be what God means for us to be. Now, even though we no longer have our own lawn, I still love to see perfect lawns and flowers. Flowers that look like flowers. But over the years, I've come to realize that since God is a very different kind of gardener, and Jesus had a lousy front yard, I'd best learn to live with weeds and odd-looking flowers, and learn to just stick to the job I've been given and do it as best I can, and let God do God's work. Amen.